Hey everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress and welcome to today's webinar using DevExpress MVVM Magic Part 2 presented by DevExpress Technical Evangelist Don Wibier. After the introductory webinars on the DevExpress MVVM Framework for WPF and WinForms, Don pulls some more rabbits out of his hat by showing some more advanced features of the framework. He will explain MVVM concepts like navigation services and behaviors and will show how easy these are to implement. He will also show how to synchronize data between different views and will come back to a number of questions asked during the initial webinars. This webinar will show coding examples for WinForms and WPF. This session is being recorded and it will be made available on our DevExpress YouTube channel later today. We will also do a live Q&A at the end of the presentation. Just type your questions in the GoToWebinar control panel at any time throughout the broadcast. All right, thank you so much for joining us. I will now hand things over to Don.
Thanks, Amanda, and again, welcome everybody. So today we're going to talk a bit more about the MVVM framework that we ship with our WinForms controls as well as our WPF controls. And yeah, I hope that you all saw either the WinForms one or the WPF one, part 1 basically. And I will go over what we've done in the previous webinars quite easy and quite quickly. So basically, what is MVVM and why? Well, it is a way, it's a design pattern which allows you to separate the business logic from the interaction on the UI, and you have a view which will only bind to properties or certain methods on the view model. And that creates a nice separation of your logic inside your application. So that is in a nutshell what MVVM is all about. So you'll have the view on the left side, which in the WPF application will be XAML. In the WinForms version it will be a WinForms user control. In the middle we have the view model, which will have all the presentation logic coded in. So there will be basically no code behind in the view, so no code behind on the XAML part. We have to use a bit of coding in the WinForms code behind of the user controls because WinForms obviously doesn't really support MVVM. But I've talked about it in the previous webinar. And then on the right side we have the model or models, which basically allows you to get the data out of, and that can be any kind of model. So it can be Entity Framework or XPO, our own ORM tool, or it can even be SQL Server or SQL commands with stored procedures, etc. Well, in case you have missed part 1, I would definitely urge, and you're totally new to this MVVM framework that we have, I would definitely urge you to check either one of those two links that you see here. The first one is the WPF version. If you are working with WinForms and you want to get into the MVVM approach, please check out the WinForms one, so the lower link. And yeah, you'll have like a really nice introduction on how this stuff works basically. So what are we going to do in part 2? Well, I have received a number of questions. A couple of them I've answered already, but I will go into detail on those particular questions as well. There were also a couple of questions that I haven't answered, but I will do that during the webinar. So first, what we're going to take a look at is well, the short introduction. So I'll show you the sample application that I created during the first webinars, and the application that I created, they are both the same for WinForms as well as WPF. So I'll show you what we've been creating. I've done a couple of tweaks here and there, but that is not really that's not really of importance right now. I will go over this really quickly. Well, one of the questions that I received was, okay, but in the demo application you have been using static data. So yes, I introduced an array with some data in there, and I was dealing with that array to to do some data transformations here and there. So what do we need to do if we want to change over to like some real data, like entity framework or any database connection? But you'll see in a minute that you can set that up pretty nice, and that it doesn't even matter what you're using. If you're using entity framework or our own ORM XPO or, well, whatever data, you'll see that it is not too difficult to switch over. Well, then I got another question like, yeah, I want to use some kind of a tree, and I want that to bind to my view model. So how am I going to do that? So I have like root nodes with child nodes, etc. So how can we do that? I'm going to talk about that as well. Then a new feature that we have, I'm going to talk about, and I do have to say that this one at current stage is only available for WPF, and that is called the view injection service, and I'll show you how you can use that view injection service to perform some navigation between different data in your application. And I said this is only available for WPF right now, but we are working to get it operational for WinForms as well. So yeah, this will be a WPF only example. But I've got another thing coming for WinForms as well, so don't worry about it. And the last thing that I'm going to discuss is, okay, so I have seen that webinar of Paul and Julian about the reporting server, and all that stuff looks really cool. How am I going to use reporting inside this MVVM application? I'll talk about the report management service, and again, the report management service is only available for WPF, but I'm gonna make it a bit nicer, because I will also demonstrate how you can create a custom service, and we'll do that for the WinForms version, so we'll have reporting there as well. So those items are basically going to be discussed during this webinar. So let's go. Before I go, I'll switch back to the bullet points, because I'll get back to the bullet points every now and then. Let's start with the short introduction on the previous webinars. So for that, I already set up my Visual Studio solution. And what you see here in the project in the Solution Explorer are two applications. The WinForms one, that is not operational right now, but it will be in a couple of minutes. And I have the WPF version, and this is basically the application that I created during the other webinars. So let me first run this application so you'll see what we have to deal with. Then I'll talk really quick about how this application has been set up. So here it is. This application only has two views. One of the views is the one that you're looking at right now. It contains a grid which is bound to a collection of music tracks. The music tracks are coming out of the Chinook database. I'll talk about that a bit more after we have done the introduction. The second view and view model that we have is, for instance, the edit track dialog. And in this case, you'll have a couple of details here. I'll be able to edit them. If I hit cancel, nothing has been changed. If I hit OK, it will be changed. Bear in mind that I was using a static in-memory array, so that means that if I close down the application and I start it up again, the changes have been lost anyway, but that is because of this particular track list file. So this is pretty rude to put in the application, but it was just for testing purposes. So yeah, I've put on a whole bunch of things here. Alright, so how is this all being achieved? Well, there is a view model for the track list, and there were a couple of things I discussed during the first webinars, and that is that there are a couple of conventions that you would need to attend to, because if you don't do it, the magic won't happen at all. And one of the things here was that we have a collection of tracks. And in this case, you'll see that we have an observable collection of track view models. And this is one small change. There are different opinions about how to approach this kind of behavior, and I would say this is the most nice one. If I go to the track view model, that holds the properties that you were seeing inside the grid. And well, another thing that we've done is we had to hide out the constructors here. So here we have a protected constructor, and that protected constructor is being used in the static create factory method, because we want this view model only to be created through the view model source, which is a factory which puts up some extra spices and some extra magic on this particular class at runtime, which makes all the magic happen basically. So, a couple of important things. What we do next on the edit track is also nice to mention, that I will create a clone of that particular track, and that is the one that we will pass on to the dialog service. I have been discussing those services in the previous webinars, and this dialog service will allow us to pop up the dialog and edit the track in this case. So in a nutshell, that is what it does. The last thing I'd like to point out, but I'm not going to spend too much time on that, is that I am using an asynchronous call to populate the list with tracks, and that is to not freeze up the UI. So I'm using a default construction here, so I'll start a new task which will populate it. What you see here is another thing that I've slightly changed, because I have put all those data access methods inside a really small class, and that is to have like the view model not to have any coding referring to that array that we are using right now. And if you go for this kind of approach, it makes it quite easy to answer the first question on the bullet list, how to use entity framework instead of static data. So let me show you what I'm doing here. In this case, there is a static method which returns an IEnumerable of track view models, and what we basically do is the track list was the static array. I will go through every element of that array, and I will yield return a collection of those track view models basically. And I'm using that static instance method for it. So that is one thing. Well, if we want to store changes made to it, I will call the persist track method here, and that will receive one of the view models. So that will basically receive the view model that has been used for editing that particular track in the dialog. What I'll do, I'll look that track up right in the array, and I will replace the data with the new values here. If the track was new, so in other words, the track ID doesn't have a value, I'll add it to the collection. But we're not doing any inserts in this demo, but it's in there just to make sure that it works. So if I get back to that slide deck here, how to use entity framework instead of static data. Well, because I have used this approach with the data access class, you could imagine that it is quite simple to switch that over to entity framework or any other data access layer. To do so, I have prepared a number of things in the project that I will point out really quick. I already created, because the Chinook database is freely available in Codeplex and you can play around with it. It's got a whole bunch of music tracks, albums, some customer information, and some nice data to test with. I have created entity framework models already, and what you see here is the code first approach for entity framework. So it has been generating a context, in this case the Chinook context, and well, if you are familiar with entity framework, this stuff probably looks pretty familiar to you. So I've prepped it already. We don't need to spend too much time on that. But the interesting thing here is what I can do now is let me comment out this line of code. So we'll make sure that we are not using that array anymore. I can now just do something like initialize a new Chinook context here. And instead of using that data, which is now redly curled, I can change that over to ctx.track. And with only these modifications, I have switched over the first view already to use entity framework. I've obviously set up my app.config connection string to get that working. And well, what we can do next, if we want to persist those changes that we might make in the dialog, I can just copy the same line of code here, put it in here. Let me properly close that down. And well, I will not need this one, and I also don't need that one, but I can just say ctx.track first. And that will be of the type track. So in this case, if I do a commit, like this, we already have switched over from in-memory data to entity framework. Let me have a quick check why this was not working. So with this in place, we have already switched over this this in-memory data store to the entity framework one. And I can just do it like this. Okay, and obviously this is where I will get to in the next second. I was doing a build all, which was obviously not the brightest of moves, because you see that my WinForms project at this stage is not building, but that will build in like a minute. So we have only changed a couple of things in the data access class. I didn't change anything on the view or the view model whatsoever, and what you see here is that we are now getting data out of the database. So you say, yeah, that's all pretty nice, but I don't know that for sure. So let me make a couple of changes here and close down the application. So remember, I changed a couple of D's on the snowball track. Let me close this down, and also let me switch over to the WinForms one, because what I do want to show is that the view model that we have been coding here is basically not depending on WPF or WinForms. It is just a view model, and the framework will take care of the specific displaying differences. So what I could do here is, if I open up the sample WinForms application, and I will copy over the code here. So I will get this one, the tracklist view model code, and I will copy that over to this empty one, and this is the WinForms version. And I'll do the same with the track view model. So that would be the individual one. Let me select all that code here and also copy it over to the track view model. Just like this. You will see that if I save this one, and I'll save that one as well, you will see that I would be able to build the project in one go. Okay, let me have a quick check here. Yeah, this is something that I will discuss a bit later because I didn't create those view models yet. Let me comment that one out. So I should now be able to run the application on the WinForms version. Let me have a quick look here. That would be in the list, and that would be the current item. Alright, so let me quickly start up the application again. So here we have it, and what you see is that we now have, well, you see some smaller differences in how the grid looks, etc. But the important thing that I would like to show you here is that, remember that I made the change on the snowballed track in the WPF version. Well, this is connected to the same database, so as you can see, it is being persisted because I'm now running the same thing on the WinForms version. So I can now also change this back again. One other nice thing to mention here is that if you remember the WPF version, we had a text box representing the album ID. What I did here is I changed the text edit into a lookup editor, and I passed in the lookup data in the view model, and that is one of the things which works really nice with an MVVM kind of approach. So let me cancel this one. Let me OK this one, so the snowball is snowballed again. And the way that I basically did that is if I open up my Visual Studio again, we'll see that in the track view model I am passing in a collection of album lookup data. And that collection is being passed in this particular get track view model list. I'm selecting it only once before I go into the for each loop. I will select it only once and I will pass in that collection right into the constructor. So I have that lookup data available inside the view model, and with that in place I have basically all the data that I want inside my view model, and I can just do binding expressions to get it all to work. So that is concerning the switching over to real data. Let's go back to the slide deck and let's talk about using tree-like data. So how can we use a tree and bind it to the to the data inside the view model? Well, for that I will use the WPF application, and I will do a couple of things here. I will drag in a couple of things that I prepared already because yeah, we're going fast in time. If I switch over to my project again, let me see where it is. Here it is. I will collapse this one, and I will code this right into the WPF application. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert a view model and talk a bit about it. I'm actually going to include two view models. One is the album tree view model. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to display a tree which contains a number of albums, and if you expand one of those albums, we'll have a collection of tracks that come with that album. And to do so, I will use an album tree view model. I will drag that into the view models folder straight away, and I'll need one for the detailed items as well. So I have two view models added. The first view model will contain all the information that is necessary to set up the tree or the tree list control. What you see here is we have an observable collection of items, and that will be album view model. So that's the second one I dragged in. And well, I have obviously hidden out the constructors. I've created the static creation methods, and there are a couple of things which are not to be found yet. But the most interesting part is, well, as you can see, it's pretty much the same as what I did with the track list view model. The most interesting part here is if I switch to the album view model, so that will be the individual album which will be bound inside a tree control. What you see here is that if I scroll down a bit, I mean the top stuff is all pretty standard according to the conventions of the framework. But what is most interesting here is that I have a collection of track view models. And the track view model I have been using before. So basically one of those items has just a collection with tracks. And well, what we then need to do is we need to add that in the data access class, because at this stage those methods are not in there. And what we need to do is we need to have a method which will get all the albums. I'll put the persist album in as well, but we'll not be dealing with updates right now. So how would that look? Well, that is pretty much the same, and there are again a couple of ways that you can accomplish it, and I have gone for like the best performing in this scenario. So what I do is I create this method, and let me put it in here and explain what it does. It is returning me an IEnumerable of album view models, and what I do here first is, and that is interesting to mention, I will load in the tracks from the database. And I will do that with the for each loop that you've seen before. And what I will then do, so I have this list of tracks in this case. What I'll then do is I will go through every album in the album entity in the database, and that album will have a filtered list with all the tracks that from that in-memory list, and it will pass it right into that album view model instance. So I have set up everything in memory, and with that in place I can also add a number of views here. So let me add those views as well, and I'll explain what they do. So here I will put in the album tree view as well as the album view. And well, the interesting thing here to mention, let me do a quick build on this project, because as soon as you add stuff you need to rebuild it, otherwise the design time features won't work. Well, the data access does not contain a method persist album. Well, it wouldn't be a surprise that that method looks quite the same as the persist track one. So let me put that in there as well. The only difference is the entity album is much smaller. It only has a title and an ID, so the code is really small in this case. If I build it again, we'll have access to the design time features here. And the most interesting thing probably to show here is if I switch over to the album tree view, it is best to show the XAML code here. You will see that I have put up a treeless control. And what I'll do is I'll bind the item source to the items collection of the album tree view model. So those would be the tracks. And the tracks have sub-items which will be the the root nodes will be the albums, and they will have items which will be the tracks. And what you see here is that I have used a Treeless Control view which works in 3 derivation modes, child nodes selector. Because I mentioned it before, we have a number of different options to get this tree to work. In this case, I have like an items with sub-items, etc. But it could also be that you want to use a self-reference data set. So you've got like a flat table, and the table has an ID, and it's got like a parent ID field. And that is also just a matter of specifying properties on the tree view, and you're all set to have this tree working. But in this case, I have gone for the child node selector because I have those items already, and we don't need to find child items depending on an ID somewhere. So the property items is the property items of one of those albums, and that will be the tracks collection. So that is basically the thing that I do wanted to point out in this particular scenario. So again, the items is used to bind to the tree, and if I run this application now, let me change this one over quickly, so we'll have the tree here. So if I go specify view and then the album tree view, and then as soon as the application loads up, you will see that we will have a list with albums. And well, I can tell you, maybe you've seen one of those albums that you know, but one of the albums that I do know is the big ones from Aerosmith. And what you see here is that it will just collapse all the tracks which are below it. There are probably a couple of other albums as well that I might know what kind of tracks are on there, but in this case, yeah, you'll see that it works pretty nice and pretty much out of the box. But as I mentioned, I mean, for your project, you might want to use one of the other approaches. There are some modes that the tree list can work with, depending on how you want to attach your data to it. So this is one of the scenarios on how to work with data with sub-items, etc. Alright, so let's get to one of the other interesting things here, and that is services and navigation. Well, one of the things that comes with MVVM is behavior. Well, we have seen that already in the first part of the webinars, but we also have services. And one of the services you have already been seeing is the dialog service, which allows us to do something on the UI from within the view model, but there is not like a direct thing. I mean, I cannot just tell in the view model like show me some dialog. That doesn't work because the view model is like data. So if we want to invoke something on the UI, we can use a service for it. And the MVVM framework that we have ships with a whole bunch of services. We have like an open file service, we have like a system tray notification service, and you can find all kinds of services in the documentation of the framework. One of the more interesting ones is the view injection service, and that allows you to, well, as it says, inject views at runtime at certain elements in the UI, and this feature is only recently introduced, and that is also the reason that this demo is only available for WPF. So it will come for WinForms, but we are working on that one. So what can we do with it? Well, let me show you a small demo application that will give you an impression on what I'm going to build. And to do so, I'm going to run a similar application as what you already saw. Here we are. And what you see here is we have the tracks grid, but on top we have like a navigational thing here, and we can actually switch over from tracks to artists. So I've got a whole bunch of artists as well. I can also edit those artists if I've set the behavior up correctly. And I put the album tree in there as well. And here we are again. So this is what we're going to build, and we're going to use the view injection service for that. So how does that work? Well, let me show you another slide so you'll have an impression of what we're going to do. What I've done is I will introduce a couple of extra views, and I will introduce a couple of one view model as well. For this navigation item, I'm going to use the tile bar which comes with WPF, and for the content pane I'm going to use the flip view, and that allows you to switch those views at runtime depending on the button that you click. And this all is being positioned inside a main view user control, what you see here below. You heard me mention about the content pane and in this case the navigation pane, and that is something which will be used in the view injection service. So let's get back to Visual Studio and show how that works. Well, to save a bit of time, I'm going to insert a couple of things in the project again, and I will start with a view model, which is a navigation item view model, and that is basically a view model which is used for all of those blue blocks that you saw in the demo. So if I put that one in here, then let me also put in the view that comes with it. Well, and the view for this navigation item is quite simple. Let me put it in so it's there. The navigation item view model, let's discuss that first. It has a title and it's got a navigation key. And the navigation key is something to identify certain views which have been injected in the service. The navigation key in this case is something that I put up in my data access class, which is just an enum, so we can identify the specific views inside the view injection service. Then it's got a title as well. Well, that would be the title that will appear in the blue block. And there is a bit of code here which I will discuss a bit later. The other thing that I have here is obviously the static instance creation method, which will receive a title and a navigation key. So that was pretty straightforward, I'd say. If I take a look at the view, it is even simpler. It has a text block where we bind the text to the title property of the navigation item view model. So not too difficult yet. Alright, so the next thing that was on the slide deck was the main view, and that will be just a user control. It doesn't have a view model behind it. The only reason we are using it is because we want to position a couple of things here. So I'm going to drag that in as well. And the main view has a couple of things that I will point out like really fast. The main view has a tile bar as I specified in the slide deck, and I have defined a navigation region, and that is something which is necessary for the view injection service. So you can have like a bunch of different collections with views and you identify them by that region name basically. Below I have used the flip view, which will use all the views that I have the region, the content area defined. So that's step one. We've inserted navigation, we have inserted the main view. Now we need to do a couple of things because we need to initialize the injection service. And the most easy way of doing so is by going to the app XAML.cs, because that only needs to be done once. And what we need to do here is we can create a method which we'll call init view injection. So just like this. And this method view injection will basically tell the injection manager which views in which regions we want to make available and how we create those views at runtime. So I'm going to paste in that method here. Don't be scared about the amount of code here, because in this case it is basically injecting the track list view model inside the content area and a navigation block which comes with it inside the navigation area. It does the same for artists. So we have the navigation item again, and I do want to show you how this works. So I'm going to drag in a couple of other views, and that is the artist list. So we'll have the same demo as you saw. The artist list, I'm not going to go over that because it is pretty much the same as we've done with the track lists. Let me put that in the views here. And I will need two view models to come with it as well. So I will drag those in there as well. Like this. And well, it's basically the same as the track list. So as I mentioned, I'm going to inject a definition for a view inside the content area, and I'm going to do it for in the navigation area as well. So we'll have those two collections of views. And then last, I'm going to tell the view injection manager to navigate to the tracks. That would be my startup view. The last thing that I would need to do is that I would have to go to the, for instance, the track list view model. That was the wrong file. And I already put in some code here. I want to happen something to happen, and that is as soon as the tracklist view model has been instantiated, I want to register and navigate event handler, and this is something which keeps track of the navigation, the selected navigation item, as well as the currently viewed view basically. So whenever the thing changes, I want to sync that up with the other area. I've done the same here. Remember that I was going to come back on this code. Well, this is to sync those things up. So if we start run the application right now, then you'll see that we obviously need to add a couple of methods to the data access class. I was a bit too fast here. And let me get those as well. That was for the other entity, so that was for the artist basically. I'm going to put those ones in here. And again, this is really the same as we did for the tracks. So that is one of the things, and while we're at it, let me also change the view inside the main form, because otherwise we'll have the tree view again. We would like to have the main view control, which will contain all this nice stuff. So that will be the main view. So that will have the tile control and the flip control, etc. And well, just to make sure, I'm pretty sure that we had everything already. Yeah, it's complete now. So if I now run the application, you'll see that we have the navigation in place by using that view injection manager. And in this case, well, here it is already. In this case, we have done it, kind of hard-coded by using an enum and some other constant factors in the application. And this is one of the reasons, because you can now also click through and you'll see that the navigation items are being synced as well. You see, I can go back and you'll see that this one is being synced up again, and that was the code that I've added in the constructor to sync up, no matter how you change views, that the right navigation item has been selected, etc. So this is something that is also coming for WinForms, but at this stage we have this view injection manager for WPF only. All right, and yeah, we're almost through our time. Let's do the last thing, and that is the report management service. The report management service allows you to, for instance, create a report from one of the grids. Let me quickly switch over to the application again. Here we are. Let me quickly add a couple of things here, because what we can do is we can use that reporting service, and what I'll do is, since we are running out of time, I have coded in a couple of things here already. So let me get over to the track list view, where I have added a button report. And what is important to have this service running out of the box is that you should use a bar split button item in this case. What I have also done is on the tree view section, or on the table view section, I have introduced a behavior, which is the grid report management service. And this is one that is not by default to be added through the design time features, but you have to add this by code. The important thing here is that I have specified a name here, which is in this case the report service. If I go to the behavior of that bar split button item, and I'll show you at runtime why we need this bar split button item, I have introduced some behavior here as well, and that behavior is pointing to a specific service, and in this case it is the report service, which is the same as the one here. So what happens here is if I click that button, that report service will be instantiated, and if I would run this application, what you'll see happening is that we have a small little button here, report, that is only, I put it only on the tracks one. If I hit this button, you will see this is why we need a split button. I can now say I want to design a report, or I can do a print preview. So in this case I'll do a print preview, and this was the grid reporting service. So that basically means that a grid has been generated, or a report has been generated from the grid. And this is basically how easy it is by just invoking that service, and that will give you an instant reporting facility. You could actually switch over to the report designer, which comes with WPF, and you could start designing that report yourself. Yeah, for that I would, how that works, all the kind of stuff, I would check one of the other webinars that we did in the past about the designer. So that is basically how that works. Then the very last thing, because you might want to have this on WinForms as well, is, yeah, in the WinForms MVVM we don't have that service yet, but it is not too difficult to create a custom print service. So I'm going to show you a couple of lines of code, because it's really not that difficult to create a custom service. This is basically my custom MVVM service. So what I've done here is I have created an interface which will have a method show report, and I have created the custom reporting service here. And what this basically does is I will pass on a grid that we're dealing with into this service, and I will use a couple of standard methods that we ship in our library with report generator, which will generate a report out of a grid view. You could do some other stuff here as well. And I will actually use a report print tool to show. So we pretty much have the same behavior, but now we have set up a custom print service to do so. Well, if we want to have this work at runtime, there are just a couple of things that we need to do here. So the first one would be, if I switch over to my view model, and I've put that code already into place, I will obviously introduce that custom reporting service by just doing this. And I will create a method which will invoke that service, and it will show the report. So this is one of the things that we need to do, and because we are dealing with WinForms, we do need a bit of code behind inside the track list view. So here's the track list view. If I switch over, I've put on that button as well. If I switch over to the code, we need to initialize those bindings, and I have been talking about this in the previous WinForms webinar. What I basically do here, I register that service where I pass in the grid view that is on this particular control, and next I can bind that bar button item that I put on top as well to the method inside the view model to show the report. So if I start up this application, you will see that I already have the show report button, and once I hit this button, it will basically just do the same as what we done on WPF. It will show my grid inside a report, And I basically have like the same kind of functionality, but in this case I have created a custom service to get the same behavior as we already had on the WPF version of this application. So with this in place, I think that we have gone through the bullet list altogether, and for a change I have put on a link on GitHub which will have the code that I have been creating here. So it will have the WinForms as well as the WPF. Clone it, play around with it, and Amanda, I don't know if there are like any more questions.
Hey Don, yeah, there are a couple questions that came up throughout. One asked about getting the source code to help them with this topic.
Well, it is just been displayed on this last slide. So yeah, check out GitHub. And by the way, there are all the webinars that I did, all the code of those webinars is available on that particular account. But this is the one that we have been talking about.
What views can be passed into a generate report method?
I'm sorry, what?
What views can be passed into a generate report method? That's a question.
I'm not sure if we are talking about the WPF version or the WinForms one that I just did. I mean, you can pass basically in whatever you like, but yeah, I would need a bit more info on that one.
Well, he just asked at 11, so I'm assuming it's about what you were showing there just at the end.
Yeah, well, maybe I'm not sure who asked the question, but
okay.
Yeah, be a bit more specific, please, and I'll answer it anyway.
Okay. Let's see. Where does the report service store the self-designed reports?
Okay, that's a good question, actually. That is something that you have to deal with yourself, obviously, because you can design the report, and I have been showing the grid report management service. We also have a standalone report management service, and this grid one is for this demo the most easy to implement, because I will just pass in that grid, or I will add the behavior to the grid and it will render a report. But if you would use the standalone report management service, then you'll be able to have reports embedded in the project, or maybe you stored the definitions on file, or yeah, that is all not with this particular one, but you'll have to use the standalone management service for that.
Okay, from Tom. In the example, are you using Entity Framework to populate other classes and then bind to them, as opposed to binding directly to the classes created by Entity Framework?
Yes. That is something where opinions might vary a bit, and I have had a couple of good discussions with my colleague, our colleague Oliver Sturm, as well as with the team who do the MVVM framework. If you search around, I mean, theoretically MVVM should separate those kind of concerns. So the view model could get data from like 10 different places, and the view doesn't even know it. But if you check out other demos, yeah, they're dealing directly with Entity Framework data, and yeah, that could be the case if you're dealing with large amounts of data, or if you're facing like performance kind of things, then you might want to consider dealing with Entity Framework objects yourself directly. But yeah, pure MVVM would get the data inside the view model and yeah, bind the view to the properties of the view model. So yeah, in this case I'm transforming the Entity Framework data inside view models.
Great. From EJ, how does the binding expression for the lookup, what does the binding expression for the lookup combo look like?
The binding expression for the lookup, that would be for WPF, I guess. I can show you that really quick because I put that in, let me see. that would be in the track view, for instance. And I think I put that in. So in this case, I have used a layout control to lay out all the controls here. If I would change this over to a drop-down, it would be something like this. Let me quickly wrap that up a bit. So this would be the case for WPF. The added value will be the album ID, and the item source will be the album lookup data, which is a collection inside the view model. And I know that the album lookup data is a collection of items which has a value and a key. If we are talking about the WinForms version, I can show you that as well. That has been done by the Fluent API that we have. And if I go to the track view here, switch over to the code, then I will use a set binding method of that Fluent API that we have for WinForms, and I will deal with the properties sub-object of the editor, and I will pass in the album lookup data to the data source collection of that. So both ways are being displayed here, so I hope that answers it.
Cool. Let's see. Does the WPF app get informed when the WinForm app changes data? And is it possible to implement something like that, notifications, for instance?
Well, at current stage, well, let's be clear. I mean, even if you have two WPF instances running of this particular application, if one changes something, it will not be notified by the other. That is like a completely different story. I mean, those applications, whether it is the WinForms and WPF or two WinForms or two WPFs, they have their own memory, they have their own items inside their own memory space. So that will never happen in this construction. But I mean, there are ways of doing so, and in that case, there are certain ways that you can accomplish that if you are hosting on a SQL server. They have like specific events that you can code with notifications and stuff like that. If you're not directly connecting to a database backend or entity framework, but you're using like a web API backend, you could be using something like SignalR to notify other clients that something has been changed. But that is a different architecture altogether. Well, that needs some more infrastructure as what I've done right now. So that is like a basically a different story, and that does not have anything to do with the applications that I've just been doing.
Okay, let's see. I know we're over time, but we only have a couple questions left.
Yeah.
Do we need report service CALs in the WPF example which you demoed here?
No, I have now been doing the reporting inside the application. But if I could imagine that if you have like you want to use the reporting server, so you want your WPF application to connect to the reporting server to do all that stuff, yeah, then you would need it. But in this case, it's just like you have a WinForms or a WPF application, non-MVVM, and you drag in like a reporting designer and a reporting control, and off you go. So everything is being processed on this particular application. So for this one, you don't need CALs.
Great. And then our last question, which is kind of a, let's see, view injection service versus navigation service. What are the advantages of using one over the other, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's obviously depending a bit on the application that you're doing. I mean, the view injection service is quite flexible, obviously, and the navigation. But then again, the navigation service is something that can be used on the. I think it can be used on the WinForms application as well. So, if you have the need to create like a WPF as well as a WinForms at the same time, or you just want to play around with it, you might want to go for the navigation service. I mean, it's basically what you find most convenient to use, because they serve like the same purpose, but yeah, they're used differently. So.
Okay. We did have one more question from Tom. He asks about binding with Entity Framework, in particular how to configure it so that you can bind properties from the view using smart tags. He says when using Entity Framework, it doesn't appear that the smart tags recognize the view model.
Yeah, are we talking about WPF or WinForms?
WPF, I believe.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, well, Tom, please drop me a mail with some specific details. I don't have a clear picture on what seems to be the problem. So drop me a mail or get it to me and I'll get back to you.
Okay. And that's all the questions, Don.
Excellent. So we're pretty much finished here.
Yeah, you want to put up your slide again with your contact info so people can, I just post it in the chat box too, but yeah, there you go. Awesome.
Yeah, there we are.
Okay, everybody. Like I mentioned before, today's webinar will be made available later on our DevExpress YouTube channel. And we do have several webinars coming up, and you can register for them at devexpress.com/webinars. Next Tuesday, March 21st, Best Practices for a Fast, Responsive, Searchable ASP.NET Grid, presented by Mehul Hari. March 28th, ASP.NET MVC, Frequently Asked Questions Answered, presented again by Don Wibier. And then April 4th, Demystifying DevExpress Charts, presented by Julian Bucknell and Paul Usher. So those are all coming up, and you can register them at devexpress.com/webinars. Also, I posted Don's previous part ones, the WinForms, MVVM, and the WPF in the chat box. I posted both those YouTube links and his GitHub link for the code. All right, and that is it for this one. Thank you so much to Don. Thank you all for joining us, and of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.